My main topic of research is consciousness, the mind. What is the mind? What is consciousness? And, well, just I just mentioned that some of the topic that I will be talking about today will be part of my next book, but this is just... So, let me say that nowadays, it's very difficult to talk about consciousness, as all of you know, in neuroscience, in a scientific context. Why? Basically, because it is impossible to find anything like our own conscious experience inside our nervous systems, inside our brains. If you look at the properties of our brains, they are completely different from the properties of our everyday familiar experience. And this is a problem that, as all of you know, is something that it is an issue in science, at least since the last century, if not more. And so far, it has been very difficult to present any working solution to the problem of consciousness. So that's why I start with a quotation by Feyerabend from Against Method. We need to look elsewhere. We need to change our approach to the problem of consciousness. And today and tomorrow, I will try just to make this conceptual shift. So let me just put forward from the beginning what I'm aiming to. First of all, I start from a premise that I am physical, that my mind is physical. This is what Maurizio was mentioning at the beginning, that somehow I'm a pure physicalist. I believe that everything, in order to exist, has to be physical. It has to be part of the spatio-temporal causal framework. It has somehow be able to fit into what we call physics. But it is probable that maybe our understanding of physics is a bit naive. So maybe one of the reasons why it is so difficult today to find a place for consciousness inside physics, it is not how could I say, it is not a problem of consciousness, but rather it is a problem of our poor understanding of physics. But having said that, the second point that I want to make clear from the beginning is that, as I will try to show, we are not our body, nor our brain. That the body and the brain are the only thing that we are not. So, although I am a physicalist, I am not a bodylist, so to speak. I don't take to be inside or to be identical to any property of my body. And I will try to show you why this fits with physics rather than being an issue for our understanding of physics. And then the last point that I will try to make is, what are we then? So I will try to answer to the question by Chris that mentioned it at the end. So I believe it is possible to find a place for us inside the physical domain. And the thing that I will suggest we are identical with is the external object. That's why I brought with me an apple, a faked one, but an apple nonetheless. And I will try to argue that we are not the body, but we are rather the external world. We are rather the world which is made of objects surrounding us. But we will need to revise a bit, to revisit our understanding of what is an object. That's why, in this case, as you will see, I said we are an object, but a relative object. And I will try to explain what it means. So, I start from the traditional question, what is consciousness? And I add also, where is consciousness? Because everything which is physical is somewhere and at some time. It may be difficult to find out where and at which time, but we know that a requirement for being physical is to be in some place and at some time. May be distributed, may be extended both in time and space, But still, to be in space-time is an important requirement. And a lot of people had the idea, especially in science, that we had to look inside the body. So since Galileo, Descartes, Vesaglio, Golgi, Penfield, nowadays, Tononi, Crick, Koch, all of these people, they keep looking inside the brain. But the more they do so, the less they've been able to explain why neurons produce anything like our own experience. A week ago, on the Time Literary Supplement, there was a nice article by the philosopher Tim Crane, who observed that basically the more we know about what the brain does, the less we know how is it possible that the brain produces anything like conscious experience. But I must admit that from a scientific perspective, the original idea was not that bad, was not such a bad idea. Because basically in the 50s, people made an hypothesis. They put forward an hypothesis. The hypothesis was that maybe inside the brain there might be something like our conscious experience. So they made an interesting hypothesis. Let's look inside brains and let's find out whether is there anything like our own conscious experience. This was a good hypothesis. They advanced a materialist theory of mind. So they suggested to look inside brains. Did they find anything like our conscious experience? This is from Penfield's famous analysis of patients. No. They didn't find anything at all like our conscious experience. And even today, if you look at the book in Neuroscience, you have this explanation. You have the external world, neural activity, neural spikes, and then all of a sudden you have the dog again. And nobody knows how to make the last step. So this is just, let's say, square one. So we haven't made any progress from the original hypothesis. And we haven't made any progress because probably it was a wrong hypothesis. So why can't we find consciousness in the real world? Well, I believe there are a series of problems. Some of them are of conceptual nature, and some of them are of empirical nature. The main problem that has suggested to many scholars to keep looking inside the brain is the issue of hallucination, illusions, and perceptual error that I put all together here as misperception. The first point. I will address the issue of misperception from an empirical perspective, hallucination and illusion, in my tomorrow talk. So today I will skip that problem. So a classic objection for people, or a classic motivation for keep looking inside of the brain, is that it seems that the brain is able by itself to produce, for example, a dream, or to produce hallucination. If that were not the case, if we were always perceiving just the external world, maybe the history of philosophy and the history of neuroscience would have been different. The problem of hallucination, the problem of illusion, is the main empirical reason to keep looking inside brains for an explanation of our conscious experience. Because in such cases, it seems possible for the brain to produce, let's say, a complete world, a complete phenomenal world out of thin air. I go to bed, I sleep, nothing is happening around my body, and still I have apparently a dream. But I will address the issue of dreams and the hallucination tomorrow. The other reason, I believe, are as important as the first point, but they are more related with our understanding of concept, let's say, of physical reality. And today I will focus on the second point mostly, namely on our understanding of the object. And I will argue that our understanding of the physical objects around us is extremely simplistic, is extremely naive, and that the external world that just surrounds us every day, round the clock, is just different from what we expect it to be. And that once we have understood the real nature of the physical world surrounding us, of the objects that are just that we are just grabbing and holding in our hands, we will be able to see a new solution to the problem of consciousness, to the problem of the conscious mind, to the question, what are we? So, first of all, it is strange that I will start to talk about the object. And I put there relative object. Why? Well, let me make one step backward. It is at least 4 centuries that we all know that some physical properties are relative properties. The best example, the simplest example, is velocity. So if this was claimed for the first time by Galileo, not far from here, in 1632. The point is the following. If I ask you, right now, this is an object. What is the velocity of this object? Is it still? It is still relative to the ground. It is still relative to you. But of course, it is moving relative to the moon. It is moving with a different velocity relative to a fly, which is flying right now. It is moving in a different way relative to a car that is parking right now. And it is moving differently relative to every molecule of air which is now in this room. So the right question, since Galileo, is that this object has, right now, infinite velocities. It is moving in all directions because there's no longer any absolute velocity in physics. Absolute velocity is a notion that has been completely dismissed. So, strange as it seems, it is a basic notion of physics that right now this object has infinite velocities in all directions. If my point is very simple, we can apply the same rationale to all properties of these objects, even to its shape, to its weight. The weight of this object here has a certain value relative to the Earth. If it were on the moon, it would be different. If I were able to compute the weight of this object relative to my body, it would be very small, but still it would be there. That's the force, the pull, which is measured by the Cavendish balance, the Cavendish scale. So basically, right now, this apple has a different weight for each of your body in this room. And I can apply the same rationale for all its physical properties. All its physical properties are relative. They're not absolute. They're not here. They are relative to other objects. In our case, for all of you, what are they relative to? What is the object that the apple you see is relative to? To a particular object, your body. So you see the physical properties of this apple in relation to your body and only to that. So what you perceive is not an absolute apple. It's not God's apple. It's not a mathematical apple, but it is the physical apple relative to your body. So all properties might be different of this apple relative to different bodies. if you touch the apple, you see a tactile apple, which is a way for the apple to exist relative to a hand that is grabbing and handling the apple. If you see the apple is taking place in a different way, and so forth. So, for example, if you see this patch here, probably you see it as green. But if you were much closer to the path, or if you had a super high resolution retina, you would see red and blue and, and green dots. So, is the patch green or red and blue? It is both. It depends on which eye the patch, this object, is relative to. It doesn't have an absolute existence. It has a relative existence. Think again about velocity, because I believe that velocity is the killer example. If you are driving at 50 miles per hour on a road, you're driving 50 miles per hour relative to the road. Now, while you're driving on this road, you cross someone else who's driving in the opposite direction at, say, another 50 miles per hour. Then you crash, unfortunately, against each other, and you take a crash at a relative speed of 100 miles per hour. But you're not going to say, I crashed at a subjective speed of 100 miles per hour. You will say, I crashed against another guy driving in the opposite direction at a relative speed of 100 miles per hour. And that speed is as physical as anything could be. It's not subjective. Likewise, my point is that the same rationale holds for all properties. It is not subjective. It is relative. So the notion of being relative is stronger and more powerful than the notion of being subjective. My point is that subjectivity has been invented in order to explain the fact that the properties of objects keep changing from one person to the next. And because we accepted the notion, the naive notion I mentioned at the beginning of an absolute object, we assume that the physical properties of the object should remain the same. And to explain that they were different for each of us, we introduce, since Galileo, the notion of let's say, an absolute, causally aloof object and a subjective experience of the object. So, in order to explain the fact that I feel this object warm, and maybe you feel the same object cold, and you feel different, we said the object has the same temperature. It is an absolute temperature. But I feel something which is subjective, mental, and private. You feel something which is subjective, mental, and private, and so on. But that was not the case. The reality was that the property of the object were different because they were relative. Maybe my body is hotter, so the temperature which is transferred from the object to me is higher in my case. So I feel the object warmer because it is actually relatively warmer. You feel it colder because maybe you have more insulation, and therefore you feel it different, but not because you feel something which is not real or something which is mental, but because the object changes in relation with the other object with which the external object is in relation with. What is the other object with which the external object is in relation with? Our body. Since we all have different bodies, each of us will bring into existence a slightly different relative world. The world that my body brings into existence is slightly different from the world that is brought into existence by Maurizio's body. Because my body and Maurizio's bodies are slightly different. Like if we were driving on the highway, and I were driving at, say, 100 miles per hour, and Maurizio is driving 120 miles per hour. We would see the relative velocity of everything on the same road very different. But that would not mean that such relative velocity that I experience and that Maurizio experience are subjective velocities. Everything is purely physical, but everything is also different for each of us, because each of us has a different body. Like if we were all different scales, we would all measure different weights in a way. So that's the basic idea that I want to put forward, that the world is made of relative objects. And there are very nice examples. For example, if you look at the line of the moon on the sea, maybe you think that the line of the moon is there, but it's not the case. There are infinite lines of the moon everywhere. All the sea is shining in the same way, but each of us sees only a line of the moon, his own or her own, the line of the moon which exists relative to his or her body. So, to get close to the conclusion of the main idea, of the first idea. We can be physicalist, like I am, without being neuralist, without believing that the brain is the thing that we are. We can be physical without looking for ourselves inside of the brain. Most of neuroscientists are trying to find, let's say, an explanation of the mind in terms of mind-body identity theory. They say if you're a materialist, you have to believe that one way or another, your experience, your conscious experience, is a property of the brain. But why? The brain is not the only object around. We can reject that idea, and we can substitute that idea with the possibility that the thing that we are is not the brain, but the external object. So, very roughly, when I look at, I brought also a plastic brain. When you have someone looking at an apple, and you look for the experience of that someone, don't know whether it is a male or female brain, so don't know which. Anyway, so if you're a physicalist, you must look for his mind, his experience in the world. So there has to be something here which is one and the same with her own experience. And when this person looks at the apple, what are the properties of her experience? I would say that when I'm looking at the apple, the properties of my experience are something very much red, reddish, round, applish in a way. If I had to describe my experience, I would use adjectives that are like that. Right now, my experience of the apple is something red, something. But we all know that in neuroscience and in cognitive science, one of the first things that they teach to students is that a mental representation of red doesn't have to be red. But how is that possible? That's a contradiction. Because in the natural world, if I want something wet, it has to be wet. If I want something red, it has to be red. This notion of cognitive science and neuroscientists that the brain can be about red without being red is nothing short of a miracle. Because in the real world, when I want to have a yellow wall, I have to take yellow paint. The properties in the world are what the objects have. So, roughly, if I had to look for my experience of an apple, which is red, round, and applish, is there anything right now here which is red, round, and applish? And my wild hypothesis, which is this one, is that the very thing which I am when I experience, I perceive an object, an apple, is the apple, which is outside my body, which is out of my nervous system, which is out of my skin. If I had glasses, it would be on the other side of the glass rather than being on this side of the glass. So basically, the notion that I would like to discuss is that the conscious experience of the apple is the apple itself. In the same way, this hypothesis is physicalist insofar as it is a physical hypothesis about what is my conscious experience of the apple, but at the same time is completely different from the approach of neuroscience, that they keep looking for something like my experience of the apple inside the brain. I say, look at the apple rather than at the brain. The apple is just like my experience of the apple. So neuroscientists look for the experience inside of the brain. Dualists have been looking for the experience of the apple, nobody knows where, outside of the physical domain, but it's a bit unclear. Other people like Gibson, like an activist, like Hatto, like Kevin O'Regan, have been looking for the interaction between our body and the apple, but once again, it doesn't have the right properties. If I look at the interaction between myself and an apple, it doesn't look like an apple. It looks like an interaction between my body and the apple. And I put forward this radical hypothesis. Let's make the leap. We are the world that we perceive. And this would provide a scientific solution to the problem of perception. What is perceiving something? Perceiving something is to be what we perceive. And our body is our way to allow us to be the external world. So we bring into existence a world. And now you will see, so I have the T-shirt, and which is the same. So this is what I call the spatio-temporal board. So everything in nature has to fit into such a board, has to be there in space and time. And there's the object, and there's the body or the brain. And I assume that whatever we are, it has to be here, somewhere. Science nowadays focuses mostly on the body. They keep looking for our experience, for us, there, in the brain. Francis Crick famously said in the astonishing hypothesis in 1996, we are nothing but what our neurons do. But they have not been able to find anything like us inside brains. No matter how much effort they put into the quest. So why don't we consider the maybe preposterous hypothesis that we are just external object, but not the naive, absolute, causally aloof external object, the object that doesn't change, the object which is an abstraction, the object that science or physics describes with mathematical equations. Not that object. That object is not a real object. It is a conceptual abstraction. When I describe reality with equations, mathematical equation, I am doing exactly what I just said. I am describing reality with mathematical equations. That means that reality is different from mathematical equations. Mathematical equations are the tool that I use to describe reality. They're not one and the same. So when I perceive reality, I don't perceive mathematical equation from physics. I don't perceive the absolute naive objects. I perceive relative objects that exist in the way they do because they are relative to my own body. So it should not be a surprise that they keep changing, because my body keeps changing. So it is as though, I keep back on the example on the highway, if I keep changing my velocity, if I keep accelerating or decelerating, the relative velocity of all other cars would keep changing. And not because they change, but because I change my relative velocity. So, rather than having the traditional, very complex situation that we have in physics, where we have a body, experience, an object, representation, information going back and forth, all kind of emergence in order to safeguard the general notion. Here we have just two objects. One is our body, and crucially, one is us. Only we are not our body. There are two objects, our body and external object, or a collection of external objects. And my hypothesis is that we are just the other objects. So one can say, but the object is not there. This is a classic objection. And tomorrow we will talk about hallucination and how can I explain that we can be an object when apparently there is no object in front of us. So now probably you see why at the beginning I said that the mortal objection to what I was going to say to you today was hallucination. Because this approach seems to require to have always an external object in front of us in order to be the object that I experience. So right now you can, for example, admit to be this room, because you have a room that you can be identical with. But you could say, when I will go to sleep tonight, and I will dream of this room, how will that be possible if there will be no room I could possibly be identical with? I will reply to this question tomorrow. Right now, let me just say one more thing. You could say, but will objects still exist when we are not in front of them? And I will say, objects work a little bit like fridge light. You know, this is my child looking inside the fridge, and he's asking himself, is the light open? Is the light switched on when the doors is closed? And of course, as far as his experience goes, the light is always on. Because every time he opens the door, the light is there. And the same is true for the world we are in. Whenever we experience the world, our body is there. Our body is like opening the door. Our body brings into existence the world in a certain way. And we cannot be in a place without our body being in that place. So the body is important. I'm not saying that the body doesn't have any role in shaping the thing that we are. Only our body is not the thing that we are. The thing that we are is the relative object that takes place every time our body offers the right causal circumstances for that object to exist. That's my basic idea, and I let some space for questions. Thank you very much.